Hello, my name is Andrew Keene. Welcome to Keene on America, the daily interview show about the United States. Hello, everybody. I have to admit that my famous political remark, American political remark, comes from Texas. Everyone had associated it with Ann Richards, although apparently it was originally made by Jim Hightower. It says that there is nothing in the middle of the road but yellow stripes and dead armadillos, suggesting, of course, that anyone in the middle of politics is going to get run over in that great state of Texas, at least. And I'm thrilled that we have a Texan politician, a man of the center in many ways, Ben Barnes. I'm not going to give away your age, Ben, but you're certainly older than I am and older than most of our listeners. You've been around Texan politics for 50 or 60 years.
I may be older than everybody.
You're older than everyone, but certainly you have a beautiful voice and you're wiser than everyone too. And you've put all that wisdom into a new book, Get It Done, 7 Decades of Lessons from a Political Legend, which is, of course, Ben Barnes. He's talking to us from Nantucket. Normally lives in Austin, but it's a bit sticky there. Ben, congratulations on the book and the life. What about that Jim Hightower phrase about there being nothing in the middle of the road but yellow stripes and dead armadillos? Have you survived for 7 decades, Ben, by being in the middle of the road?
Well, that was a very articulate phrase that my friend Jim Hightower came up with. And you got to remember that was in an era in Texas politics when we didn't have anyone but Democrats in office. We had different shades of Democrats, but while I presided, I served as Speaker of the House and Lieutenant Governor, so I presided over both legislative bodies. And out of the 31 senators, there were 1 Republican, and out of the 150 House members, there were 3 Republicans. So the Republicans were a very, very minority party, and so it was really the Democratic Party. But Jim Hightower represented the left side of the party in Texas, and he campaigned and lived on the left side of the center line. And that was a great phrase when he was trying to solicit people to join him and his movement. It's a lot like the movement now of the Democratic Socialists. Jim was a good public servant and a good man, but he was much further to the left than the Democratic Party in Texas was at that time.
So what are your politics, Ben, over these 7 decades? Have they remained consistent, or can they only be understood in Texan terms rather than national terms?
I have remained a Democrat, and I'm one of the few people that was friends with a lot of the people that were very prominent Democrats in Texas. People like President Lyndon Johnson, Vice President John Garner, people like Sam Rayburn. And the Texas delegation that had so much power.
And John Connally, of course.
And John Connally switched parties. Lyndon Johnson never switched parties. And I've remained a Democrat, and I have supported the party through the years. I have done it with some enthusiasm and sometimes more enthusiasm, depending on the person. I raised money in the southwestern part of the United States for John Kerry, and was very active in his campaign. Of course, the first campaign I ever worked in was the Kennedy-Johnson campaign, and I campaigned very hard for Senator Kennedy and Senator Johnson, and that was my first entry into politics. I got elected to our state legislature when I was a freshman in law school, so I was just 21 years old when I went to the state legislature, and then I was elected speaker when I was 26 and lieutenant governor when I was 30. So I spent a lot of time in the early part of my life and being very, very active in politics. I've still remained active, but I have had a lot of other things that have taken up my time, including serving on the Johnson Library Board and helping put together the Public Policy School, the Lyndon Johnson Public Policy School, that has campuses in at the University of Texas in Austin and in Washington. And I'm very proud of that school, and I've actually done some teaching at that school, and I've enjoyed all of that tremendously.
Ben, you were talking about Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, of course, assassinated in Dallas. Were you there?
I was in Austin. I helped advance that trip of President Kennedy's trip to Texas. I spent 6 weeks working with the advance team from the White House, and I had gone on that route many times, or having rehearsals of what was going to happen when the president came. But I went as far as Fort Worth. I was at the breakfast that morning before President Kennedy went to Dallas. I caught a plane after Kennedy and Johnson left Dallas and went to Austin, because Austin was the big gala the night that President Kennedy was killed. That was our main fundraising dinner, and that's what Kennedy came to Texas for. That was the real purpose of the trip, to raise money, because he'd not gotten any money out of Texas in 1960 because his agreement with President Johnson and Johnson accepting the vice president, that Johnson said all the money that we raise in Texas needs to stay in Texas. We're going to carry Texas. If we don't,
very LBJ, right?
And President Johnson said, and he was correct, we're going to have all the money in Texas, because Kennedy and Johnson, even with Johnson on the ticket, only carried Texas by 40,000 votes. So it was a close race, and the money was needed. But in 1964, it wasn't going to be that close a race, and Kennedy wanted some money out of Texas to spend nationally, and we were happy to provide that.
So what's your theory, Ben, on the assassination? Of course, many conspiracy theories, many films, books have been written about it. Your friend John Connally was in the car, was wounded. Was there just one shooter? Well, what's your theory?
Well, as I say in my new book, Get It Done, I have a chapter on the assassination. I believe the Warren Commission did not get it entirely correct. John Connally was a hunter and knew a great deal about rifles, and he always disagreed with the Warren Commission that there were not 3 shots, but there were 4 shots. And because the Warren Commission came to the conclusion that the shot that hit President Kennedy in the back of the head then ricocheted and hit John Connally in his lungs. And Connally was sitting in the front of the car, and as you can see on your screen, and Kennedy was sitting in the back of the car. And Connally says it was a physical impossibility for that shot to hit Kennedy and then ricochet over and hit him. So he said there was not 3 shots, there were 4. The Warren Commission all agreed there were 3 shots. Now, there's the theory about there being another shooter coming from a different direction. I don't think that'll ever be answered. I don't think it'll ever be proven. And I have still people call me and write me, even after this assassination has been behind us for 50 years, still with different theories. And there's a theory, and there's film that were taken that shows some smoke coming up, not out of the book center, but out of the grassy knoll that was next to the railroad track that Kennedy and Connally were going under. So I think as John Wilkes Booth's theory of being Booth having some help, and there's still many questions raised about Lincoln's assassination, I think there'll still be questions raised about Kennedy's assassination. And I do not believe that there's anything in the files that have not been released that are of great importance. I was a friend of Ted Kennedy, and Kennedy wanted to make certain before he died, when he found out he had cancer, that the public had an opportunity to know everything that was in that file. And Senator Kennedy felt like that everything that was in there had been made public, and he wanted that done. And I believe that Lee Harvey Oswald had some mental problems, and I'm sure he had a hatred for Kennedy. But Lee Harvey Oswald went to work 30 days prior to the assassination at the school book depository in Dallas. Well, now everybody said, well, he went to work there because the cars were going to come by there and he'd have a shot at the president. Well, that's not what was planned. We changed the parade. We weren't even going to have a parade in Dallas because we didn't have enough time. At the last minute, we decided to have a parade, And our senior senator from Texas, then Ralph Yarber, argued for a parade. He said John Kennedy should not come to Dallas and not be seen by the public. Well, Yarber won that argument, and we were going to have a parade route. But we were going out to the State Fair, which is the official grounds of the State Fair in Texas, and have a luncheon in the woman's building there, and there 2,000 people could stand in the back of the room and see Kennedy, and that's what we wanted. But we ran out of time from the standpoint we could not get Kennedy from Fort Worth to Dallas, do the motorcade, go out all the way to the State Fair, and then come back and get him on the plane and get him to Austin, where he had 3 functions. He had 2 receptions, and then he had the dinner. So we ran out of time, and so we moved the luncheon in Dallas to a venue very close to Love Field. And so we changed the parade route, but we did so, and that happened 6 days prior to the motorcade going by the school book depository. Well, Oswald had gone to work there 30 days, not 6 days. He had no way to know, and those of us that were working on the route and working on where Kennedy was going to go in Dallas, we didn't have any idea that he was going that route until 6 days prior to the parade. So by and large,
what did it all teach you, Ben? You've written this book about your 7 decades in political life. What does it teach you, the Kennedy assassination in Dallas? Does it teach you that history is arbitrary, that someone is in charge, that things just happen? I mean, you mentioned the Warren Commission, you're suspicious of it. A lot of people are, including Bobby Kennedy, of course, who was Attorney General and took his own secrets of this to the grave. What does the Kennedy tragedy tell us? And what does it tell us about America, given the impact still of this assassination 70 years later?
Well, I lived and served in the 60s, and the decade of the 60s was a terrible decade in America as far as violence is concerned. Vietnam was going on, and we were having a lot of chaos and a lot of demonstrations, a lot of destruction of property and destruction of life in this country. And you remember that not only President Kennedy was assassinated in the 60s, but Bobby Kennedy was assassinated, and Martin Luther King were assassinated. And there were theories about all 3 of those deaths, that the young man that shot Robert Kennedy in the kitchen of the hotel in Los Angeles, there's still been questions raised about how he did that, and of course there was a confession of the person that killed King in Memphis, and so that's the only killer that we got a real confession from. But even as much as I had to do with, and as much as I was present, you got to understand that all of this was happening so fast I was with Bill Moyers, Johnson's press secretary, having lunch in Austin. I had landed coming back from Fort Worth, and we were having lunch. And there was I cannot really explain the confusion to you. The first phone call I got, it said that Governor Connally was dead and President Kennedy was still alive. Well, that came from the Secret Service and the Department of Public Safety in our state. Well, they got even the assassination and who'd been hit worse mixed up. There's a lot of confusion. I can't explain to you, and I can't explain for history that I know exactly what happened, or that I'm not certain. I could not get under oath and swear that I know exactly how Kennedy died in Dallas.
What about LBJ? You knew him pretty well. What was his theory, do you think?
Well, his theory was that he wanted. It was a terrible time for Johnson to have to take over and to be sworn in as president after such a tragedy had happened in his home state. And what LBJ wanted, he wanted the facts out as quick as it could happen, and us find out who fired the shots and that person be put to trial. And he wanted to go on. He wanted America to go on with our life and wanted the government to go ahead and function and work. And so he was in a hurry, not in a hurry to cover things up. He wanted the truth, but he had a tremendous responsibility to make sure the American people knew who fired the shots, but also he had a tremendous responsibility of trying to bring the country back together and to be president of the United States. And Johnson, I talked to President Johnson. Johnson had no he had no choice but to accept the Warren Commission's report. It was his commission he'd appointed. Earl Warren was from California, was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He did not want to serve as on the commission, and Johnson pleaded and begged him to do it. And finally, Johnson just announced that he was chairman of the Warren Commission. Warren was not a political ally of Johnson, and he was very respected, particularly by the more liberal Americans. And so he was a good selection because everybody had faith in Earl Warren's integrity, and he was not a suspicious appointee as chairman of that commission. But Johnson wanted that commission to find out the truth, but to find it out as quick as possible. And that's the reason he gave them all the resources of the Secret Service and the FBI and our foreign diplomatic spy agencies. All that federal agencies were turned their attention and time and their budgets toward trying to find out what
Ben, if there is such a thing as a truth drug, and we could give it to a single individual, who would we give it to actually figure out what happened in Dallas on that day? Might it be J. Edgar Hoover, Bobby Kennedy, LBJ?
I would certainly give J. Edgar Hoover, and I would also give the CIA. The CIA became very, very disillusioned with Jack Kennedy over the invasion of Cuba and the Bay of Pigs. They felt like they had a commitment from Jack Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy that they were going to send in airplanes and an Air Force strength to aid that invasion. And then when they sensed that, when the Kennedy administration sensed that it wasn't going to go like they thought it would, they did not provide the air support. And there was a lot of disenchantment. And I heard this from different CIA agents, not that they came to complain to me because they didn't think they'd do it. They didn't think they'd do any good. That I certainly didn't have the influence to do it. But I've heard several horror stories about the invasion of Cuba and the Bay of Pigs, and what an embarrassment that was to the United States. And of course, that precipitated Khrushchev providing those nuclear weapons and base those rockets on Cuba, and we had to go through all of that crisis. That was probably the greatest test of Jack Kennedy's presidency. But I don't think the CIA ever got over the fact that they didn't have the support, and the CIA was genuinely embarrassed about the invasion of Cuba and the Bay of Pigs.
What's your take on Lyndon Johnson, both in this conversation, and of course I know you write about him extensively in the book? His relations with the Kennedy family were ambivalent. There was a deep-seated historic dislike between, of course, LBJ and Bobby Kennedy. Bobby was always opposed to him being made vice president, and then once his brother was assassinated, the relations degenerated. They were barely on speaking terms. What's your take on LBJ, Ben?
Well, look, you've got to understand that the division and the hostility began, and it may begin a lot earlier than that, but in Los Angeles, Jack Kennedy offered Lyndon Johnson the vice presidency,
and that, of course, was at the 1960 or 59 convention.
It was the convention in 1960 in California, and then when Bobby Kennedy found out that, evidently Jack Kennedy offered it to Johnson without talking to Bobby. Well, Bobby actually came to Johnson's room, and I don't know this firsthand, but I've been told this. He came and tried to talk Johnson out of taking the nomination because Robert Kennedy didn't want him on the ticket, and I think that sowed ill will between Johnson and Bobby Kennedy that continued to exist through Johnson's time as vice president, and then it continued to exist with Johnson being president and Kennedy remaining as his attorney general. And I think there was the entirely different relationship between some of the Kennedys and Johnson and Bobby Kennedy. I think the president, Jack Kennedy, I saw nothing but friendship and warmth and good energy between those two men. And then I campaigned in 1960. Ted Kennedy, he was a very young man, a little older than me, but we were both very young then. And we became friends in 1960 and remained friends until Ted's death. And Ted Kennedy had a genuine affection for Lyndon Johnson, and he voted for the civil rights bills and worked for the civil rights bills and the Voting Act bill. And he was a genuine supporter of Johnson and believed very strong in the Great Society, and went to his grave. I talked to him 3 weeks before he died, and he again told me what a great president he thought that Lyndon Johnson had been. But Bobby Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson definitely had very serious feelings that were negative, and there were hostility there, and it never changed. And I think that Mr. Kennedy, Joe Kennedy, the father of all the Kennedy clan, I don't think that he was necessarily a fan of Johnson, but I don't think that he was an enemy either. I never heard any stories about Joe Kennedy being anti-Lyndon Johnson, but there are many stories in many instances, and a lot of my friends worked in the White House and were there for the years that Johnson were there, and I've not had a single one not reflect on that time that there was serious personal animosity between Johnson and Bobby Kennedy.
It's not really surprising, at least to me, that Ted Kennedy and LBJ got on. They were both men of the Senate. Your book is entitled "Get It Done." It's about getting stuff done, of course, which you've done over 7 decades in politics. Might that have also been the title of a book by Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ, about his own life? Was that his great political skill, getting stuff done? I mean, as you note, he realized the Great Society. He was a man of the Senate. He understood politics as well as anyone.
Well, he did. And matter of fact, I think there'll always be debate on where Lyndon Johnson belongs, as where he's the best president, or he's number 10 or 11 or 15 or 16. And you know, the historians around the world and historians here in the United States put out an annual rating of who they think was number 1 to number 47. And Johnson has continually gone up the list and has been recognized more as I think he was at 15th at one time, and now I think he's 9th, 10th, or 11th. They're different ratings, but I think I can say this and repeat what you said. Johnson was a man of the Senate, and I have not made a careful historical analysis of all the majority leaders of the Senate, but I truly believe, based on what knowledge that I have, that Lyndon Johnson was probably one of the greatest, if not the most effective majority leader in the United States Senate. He did get, as the title of my book says, "Get It Done." He did get it done. He was an insatiable worker, and he worked 18 hours a day on passing legislation. And I don't think anyone would have ever been able to pass the legislative program that he passed, but he did so much. He created Medicare and Medicaid. He created EPA for clean water and air. He created public broadcasting and television and radio. He passed the Civil Rights Bill, the Voting Rights Bill, the Fair Housing Bill.
Right, and a lot of that stuff, obviously, as someone from the South, which was, I mean, whether or not Texas is really the South is, of course, another conversation, but certainly coming from LBJ and his associations with the South added to the story, the political story of all this.
Well, it really did, and it's really people are being reminded of that now, and people are talking about it, because I think this current administration has gone way out of anything to support Johnson's civil rights and voting rights bill, and the voting right bill that the president is now holding Congress's feet to the fire to try to pass, and talking about the elections not being fair, not being honest. I think if that bill passes, that will be one of the final nails in the coffin of Johnson's voting right bill, and minorities, no matter what anybody says about that legislation, it will make it harder for everyone to vote, but it's going to make it particularly harder for minorities to vote. And I think that's what this administration wants, and certainly not what Johnson and Everett Dirksen helped him, the Republican leader in the Senate. They did an incredible job passing the voting rights bill in 1965, and it will be a real step backwards and a bad day in America if that voting rights bill passes.
I want to come to that later. I want to get your wisdom, Ben, on Trump and the current administration. But before we get there, LBJ was also a very bullying character. I don't know whether you saw that side of him. I know you write about Hubert Humphrey in the book as well, his vice president who was bullied. Yeah. Did you see that side of him and the way he treated Humphrey in particular?
Well, I saw Johnson at his best probably with Humphrey, because I was running for lieutenant governor in 1968. That was the
number 2 position in Texas, right?
Yeah, and that was and Hubert Humphrey was running for president. Well, Hubert Humphrey did not defend Vietnam as strongly as Johnson wanted him to, and there was some ill feelings about that. But the last 60 days of that campaign, and I was working in that campaign, I didn't have a real tough opponent, and I won by 700,000 more votes than anybody on the Democratic ticket. So I had time, and I was helping Humphrey. But the last 60 days, I saw Lyndon Johnson turn and do everything he could to help Humphrey and to campaign like he was campaigning for himself. And I saw his genuine feelings for Humphrey. Johnson had a very strong personal feeling for Mule and Hubert Humphrey, and cared for them a lot. And he was almost as excited as he was when he carried Texas, when Hubert Humphrey actually carried Texas by a few more votes than Johnson and Kennedy had carried. So, but you know, it's very interesting. And you, a student of history, Andrew, but you can really charge almost any president of the United States, certainly during my lifetime, with not paying enough attention to the vice president, or not letting the vice president have enough say, or not make sure the vice president has a role. Now Obama changed that a little bit with Biden, and I think Trump has changed it a little bit with Vance. But you know, Lyndon Johnson told me this story that when World War II, when the atomic bombs were developed, Truman did not know that we had those weapons when Roosevelt died, and he had to be briefed before he could make the decision of exactly what an atomic bomb was. Well, that I would consider that not very good communication with the vice president. But I have heard criticism of how that Nixon ignored Agnew, and I've heard how that Kennedy ignored Johnson. It's almost every single story of an administration. There's always some rumors that the vice president is not having enough authority, or the vice president being treated badly by the president. And I think that's just part of the game. And it happens between the governor and the lieutenant governor in a lot of states. And in Texas, statutorily, that our office of lieutenant governor has more power than the governor has. And as a result, almost every single governor and lieutenant governor don't get along as good as they should, because the governor's mad because the lieutenant governor has so much power in Texas. So it is a fight over power and personalities, and to be successful in politics, people are very critical of politicians for having egos and being egomaniacs and not paying attention to anybody but themselves and being self-centered. I say that after looking at this world for the many decades I have, that an ego is part of being a good leader in politics. If you didn't have some ego, you wouldn't go do all the things that you have to do and travel and work as hard and put in 18, 19, 20-hour days if you didn't have a gigantic ego. And so I have, in my mind, I've always begun to more and more think it's a positive rather than a negative if a president has a large ego and he doesn't necessarily share the credit that a lot of people deserve that helped that president be successful.
Yeah, and certainly LBJ had an ego. You mentioned Nixon. He had an ego too. He was the vice president in the Eisenhower administration. Then, of course, defeated Humphrey in the 1968 presidential election. I know you knew Nixon and you write about him in the new book, Get It Done. In a way, Nixon got stuff done, although, of course, perhaps in some ways he got too much stuff done.
Yes,
what are your memories? What are the lessons of Nixon? You mentioned when it comes to polls of historians of former American presidents, he usually turns up at the bottom, or maybe not quite at the bottom anymore, but certainly close to the bottom. Was he a terrible president?
Well, you've got to judge Nixon, and I guess I've got more personal feelings about Nixon than anyone because he really tried to bring an end to my political career, and he was successful. And he used
how, Ben? Explain.
Well, what he did, he told his Attorney General John Mitchell, because I was running in the polls in '68. I was running ahead of both of the senators we had in Texas by 12 or 15 points, and I was winning the governor's race by 18 points. And so I had helped Humphrey carry Texas, and that made Nixon very mad because he thought that he should carry Texas, and it was a big surprise to everyone that he didn't carry. But he told John Mitchell, and this all came out of the Nixon tapes. I have the tapes in my possession, where he told his Attorney General to go to Texas and get something on Barnes. We've got to embarrass him, and we got to create a scandal down there because we got to get rid of him right now, because if he gets a hold of the governor's office, then Texas will stay Democratic, and we'll have trouble in '72 when they run for re-election.
And of course, Mitchell eventually went to jail, not for that, though.
He did not for that, but he went to jail for using the power of his office to punish his enemies, and also the power of his office to do things that were illegal under the electional laws of the United States, and like breaking into the Democratic headquarters and trying to get he thought they had a lot of secrets there. But Nixon's own party finally, after the Watergate hearings, and it was made public, Howard Baker was the Republican leader in the Senate, and he and Everett Dirksen and a group of people, Barry Goldwater, but a group of very prominent Republicans, went to the White House and told Nixon if he didn't resign, they were going to vote to impeach him, and he was going to be the first president to ever be impeached and thrown out of office, and that's when he resigned. So Nixon, similar to this administration, Nixon tried and did abuse the laws of the United States as a power grab and to stay in power more so than until this recent situation we've had. And it was after John Mitchell served 3 years in the penitentiary that he called me and asked me to go to lunch. And I was overwhelmed at why he wanted to have lunch with me. And we sat down and had a bowl of spaghetti in Washington, D.C. And John Mitchell said, Ben, I want to tell you, I had time to think in prison about some of the things I did. And he said, I'm sorry about what happened to you, because you're a good man, and I'm sorry the role I played, and I hope you'll forgive me. And I told him I would forgive him. And then 3 months later, he fell over on the sidewalk in Washington and died. But I'm glad the Attorney General and I got to have that conversation. But he and Nixon both, I went to the White House to see them, and they swore up and down that they were having nothing to do with what was happening to me in Texas. Of course, I knew they were having everything to do. But we're seeing a lot of these same tactics now used in this administration, and it's very, very unhealthy. And it's,
to put it mildly, and I want to come to this administration. Before we get there, I mentioned earlier that I got Ann Richards wrong, a remarkable woman. She didn't do that armadillo comment, but she made some very funny comments about George W. Bush, of course, the 43rd U.S. president, now people look at him a little more positively, particularly, I think, in the light of Trump. Was Richards right, Ben, to be so critical of G.W. Bush? Was he a man of remarkable privilege and little ability, in your view?
Well, no, I think this. Of course, he had a good family background, and he went to the right schools and had the right opportunities presented to him in his life. But his dad was a disciplined guy and a pretty good guy. You'd like to go fishing or hunting with.
And this was the elder George Bush, of course, who was Connecticut George Bush rather than Texas George Bush.
Yes, but George Bush too. He was a smarter guy than people gave him credit for. I think now there's a situation where a vice president had a tremendous amount of power in an administration. As a matter of fact,
you mean Cheney?
Cheney, and I think Cheney made some mistakes and gave George Bush some bad advice that he took. It. I think the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan was a mistake after 9/11, and I think it hurt the United States. And I think our invasion of those countries probably have added to our misery and our woes now in the Middle East, because I didn't think the Middle East could be really fouled up any worse than it was. But I think that President Trump has changed my mind. I think right now we have a lower prestige in the Middle East as far as the leader of the free world, and we've made some very bad mistakes. And John Connally warned Ronald Reagan and did a national television program in 1980, which he said that if we didn't do something about Iran, that we were going to be in real trouble, and their control of the Straits of Hormuz are going to cause world problems, and that little narrow waterway there could cause the United States and its allies to suffer very serious problems in addition to energy problems, and someday cause a world recession because of the price of oil. And John Connally in 1980 made those statements and did a national television program because he was running for the Republican nomination, in which he told this very story. And what he predicted 45 years ago is happening right now.
So I know you're chomping at the bit, Ben, to talk about Trump and all these characters. You've known them. You've been in national politics now, or Texan politics, for 7 decades, and that's the point of your new book, Get It Done. It's a memory. It's a autobiography. Is Trump different? I mean, you indicated that he's trying to reverse a lot of LBJ's legislation, the Voting Rights Act, maybe even some of the civil rights stuff. Have we seen Trump before? You mentioned that Connally warned us about the Middle East back in the 80s. It's a familiar warning about American overreach, of course, extending to Vietnam too. Is what Trump is doing, you've been in national politics now for 7 decades, is it surprising you, or is he just resurrecting old ghosts?
No, it surprises me. I don't think Donald Trump had prepared himself to be president of the United States. I don't think Donald Trump is a student of history. And I don't think that and the press has written numerous times about him not paying attention to his national defense briefings that the president gets every day, and that he acted bored and looked out the window sometime when people were trying to tell him what was happening around the world. I've not heard from Trump's very good friends that the president has read a lot of books. And I think that maybe in his first term, he surrounded himself with some people that were more knowledgeable in foreign policy than he has this second term. And I think that there is a real lack of depth in the team that's around the president right now, and it's giving him the advice. Mark Rubio, the Secretary of State, is a bright guy. But his Secretary of Defense or Secretary of War, as he called him, has had very little experience. He was a journalist at Fox News. I just feel very uncomfortable about who are the people that are in the Situation Room when the President Trump is making the decisions now that's affecting. It's not affecting the 50 states of the United States of America. It's affecting the world. And when we cough and get sick, well, the world kind of gets pneumonia now, whether we like it or not. And I think that's what's happening. And we've seen America's prestige dwindle in the last decade tremendously. And I'm very, very concerned about it. I think we have to be a member of NATO. I think we have to work with other nations. I don't think we can run the world. I don't think we have the assets and the resources. We don't have the monetary resources, and we don't have the human resources and the intellectual resources to be the ruler of this world. We've got to have friends and work with them and build alliances and count on our allies as much as we count on ourselves.
To borrow a Texan metaphor, can Texas become the United States' Alamo in the sense that that you've, over your 7 decades in politics, you've seen this sharp shift to the right when you were involved? When you began under LBJ, Texas was a Democratic state. You said the other party barely existed. Now it seems in some ways the Democrats barely exist. Can Texas reinvent itself, Ben, and start to recalibrate power in America between Democrats and Republicans?
I think Texas set an example for a lot of the states that turned from blue to red, and it wasn't only Texas; it was the South too. And matter of fact, President Johnson said to me and a group of other state officials at the White House in 1965, the day he signed the voting rights bill, he said, "Now, fellas, I want y'all to know that," and it was a group of young people, young leaders there that were already elected in southern states, and we were having a meeting of southern leaders, and we had gotten invited to the bill signing at the White House, and then we went up to the Capitol with Dr. King and Johnson to sign it. But Johnson said today, and he looked us all very straight in the eye and was very serious. He said, "What I'm doing today in signing this bill is probably going to turn the South Republican, and they're probably going to remain Republican for 30 or 40 years. And you guys are just going to have to work and tell the story over and over again."
Yeah, remarkably prescient. The fact you were there is chilling, Ben, in a way.
Yeah.
Such a prescient and an important remark.
Yes, it really was. And all of the Southern guys and many of those guys, there were about 12 of us that went over there, and I'd say that 11 or 12 of them went on to hold higher office and witnessed what was happening in the South. But the South was not for the Civil Rights Bill. When I say not for, there was certainly maybe 40% of the people, but they were not, the majority of the people were not for what Johnson was doing with civil rights and voting rights. And it did turn a lot of people into Republicans, and they stayed Republican. And Texas is, there's people talk about red states. I don't think there is really a redder state right now than Texas in the United States.
So you don't give Talarico any chance?
Yes, I give him a chance. I think he's got great mental capacity and understands and makes a very good presentation. I think he's one of the best candidates that's come out of Texas in the last 40 years since we became such a Republican state. I think he is one of the best Democratic candidates that the Democratic Party has produced.
And are there people in the Republican Party, in your view, Ben, who want to push America back into Jim Crow? There are thinkers, especially within the African American community, who suspect that the Southern strategy that Nixon pioneered in response to LBJ's Great Society, that it will eventually push the South back to a kind of Jim Crow culture.
I thought when in the 1960s, And you were correct. What a fortunate person I was to witness civil rights and voting rights becoming laws. I really thought that we'd made a lot of progress, and it wasn't until the last few years that I came to understand that there was still a lot of racism and a lot of animosity and a lot of distrust between races, particularly in the South. Although it might have been dormant during the 80s and 90s, that all of a sudden here it is, it resurfaced during the early decades of this century, and racism is alive and well in this country. And I'm very concerned about it. And I'm concerned about people being told that they can't even have equal opportunities. It's almost like that this administration is trying to push back browns and black Americans. And you know, yesterday in the news, there was a report that our Secretary of Defense is not going to be promoting any more women to admirals and generals and top officers in our military for the next decade, because how he's arranged the promotion system is going to be discriminating against women. And I was in office when we passed the first equal rights for women. So I think the story of this administration is not only about Black Americans and about civil rights and about voting rights, but it's about all minorities, including women. And I'm just very discouraged that with the progress we've made with women and with multiracial people in this country, it's a sad day. Women are equal to men, and women, and the decision was made for women to be in the military and to play tremendous roles. We got 2 new governors that have served in very serious leadership positions in combat. The governor of Virginia and the governor of New Jersey. Women have proven themselves on the battlefield to be very able warriors and very able leaders, and we're going backwards in that area, and I don't think that's good. I've got 3 daughters and granddaughters, and it worries me about what's going to happen with what's happening every day in this country. What's going to happen in the next decade to minorities.
Finally, Ben, you've left us with this book. It's already out. Get It Done, 7 Decades of Lessons from a Political Legend. In closing, you've led a good life, a civic life. A lot of concern in this country that smart young Americans aren't going into politics. You were and are a smart American. You were young, less young now. What's the argument for, Ben, living a life of public service that you've led? Why would a kid, maybe your granddaughter or your grandson or friends of your grandkids, why should they go into public life like you? Why wouldn't they want to go out, make some money, go into tech or go into law or medicine? What's the value of your life, Ben?
Well, as you get a little older, and I'm certainly the one thing I've accomplished in my life is that I've gotten older and still alive. But I must say that my life in politics was an accident. It happened. I'd not planned. I'd not dreamed of being in politics, and events happened that pushed me in that direction. But it's so important for my granddaughters and grandsons. But it's so important for young people to get involved. We just had a runoff in Texas in our United States Senate race, where Talarico was in the Democratic primary runoff, and the nominee, our Attorney General Paxton, was in the Republican, and those races took place 60 days ago. Only 7% of the people voted. 7%, not 70%. 7% of the people voted in those runoffs. Well, that's the minorities in both parties. Now, I'm not talking about race. I'm talking about minority in numbers, electing people or nominating people to very important would-be positions. And if we don't get a lot more people interested in politics, and it takes young people to get people interested in politics. It takes young people with their energy and their enthusiasm and their intelligence. and they're obviously serious-minded vision for America. If they're not in politics, or a certain percentage of them are, if they're not assuming leadership positions on the school boards, the commissioner courts, the city councils, if we don't have the very best leaders in our country, or very potentially best, if they're not working on politics every day to make certain this country's better, then we may not ever celebrate a 250th next birthday of this country. And I came to this country believing that we were invincible, because I grew up as a bear. I was born. I was 3 years old when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, and I saw from my little farming community on that Monday after they'd bombed Pearl Harbor on Sunday night, I saw pickup loads of young men standing in the back of pickups, because we didn't have enough cars then. But where were they going? They weren't going to the fields to work where they worked every day. They were going to a town called Brownwood in Stephenville, small town, 20,000 people. But they were going to go join, and they were going to go fight the Germans and the Japanese. They were going to go fight for this country. And I, even though at 3 years old, I knew something important was happening. And then I saw the men come home in their uniforms, and they were worked upon as heroes. And as Tom Brokaw said, they were the greatest generation. Well, today, I don't see that patriotism. I don't see. I don't want us to have to go to World War III to be able to determine what degree of patriotism and what we care about. But that generation died for this country. The least that this generation of young people can do is get out and get involved and get good men and women running for office. And they must do that. And that's one of the reasons I wrote this book is I want to make certain that people understand how important our government is to our way of life.
Well, there you have it. The legend, Ben Barnes. I'd heard about you, Ben, but this was a real honor to talk to you. The new book is out. Get It Done, 7 Decades of Lessons from a Political Legend, distilled into a few hundred pages. Congratulations, Ben, and continue being a legend and giving the rest of America your wisdom. I think we still need it, especially these days. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Andrew, and thank you for providing a forum for people that have messages that want to encourage people to do better in this country and to do better in the world. But thank you very much for your service and your contribution.
Hi, this is Andrew again. Thank you so much for listening or watching the show. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe. We're on Substack, YouTube, Apple, Spotify, all the platforms. And I'd be very curious as to your comments as well on what you think of the show, how it can be improved, and the kinds of guests that you would enjoy hearing or listening to in future. Thank you again.